Latrell Sprewell, one of the most terrifying shooting guards to ever step on an NBA hardwood. The man who lit a fire under an entire city with hands that didn't ask anyone's permission. From a kid no one expected at the 24th pick of a draft, he rose to become the star that 19,000 fans at Madison Square Garden would stand and roar for every time the ball touched his hands. With speed, willpower, and the eyes of a man who didn't know fear in big moments, he led an eighth-seeded team, a team no one believed could go far, past everyone to stand at the door of the NBA Finals in 1999. Latrell Sprewell, the man who earned $97 million with his bare hands, the man who stood in front of the cameras after that season and looked straight into the face of the entire United States and said, "I'm the American dream." But behind those numbers is a story no one dares to tell in full. A journey submerged in the darkness of a fatherless childhood, wounds that were never healed, decisions that cost everything, and an ending that no sports headline wanted to stop long enough to look straight at. The world remembered him. But it only remembered one moment. 10 seconds in 1997 and a line about $21 million. As if that was the entire man, and 13 seasons were just a small footnote underneath. Very few people were willing to look at the rest. At the kid from North 41st Street, Milwaukee, who carried wounds from home onto the basketball court, from the basketball court into the locker room, from the locker room into every relationship in his life. And not $1 of that $97 million was enough to buy back what had been lost. Before we begin, if you ever remember one play of Sprewell's, one single time he held the ball in the final seconds, and the whole arena held its breath, leave a like right now as an acknowledgement that the man behind those plays deserves to be known for more than what people have said about him. April of 1977, Latrell was 6 years old. No one knows how that night started. With an argument, with being drunk, with something breaking inside a man who had carried too much for too long, without anyone asking if he was okay. The only thing a 6-year-old kid remembers is the sound. The sound of furniture being overturned, the sound of a mirror shattering, and the sound of the color TV, the one the whole family had saved up for so long to buy, the one 3 kids sat in front of every night like it was the only window to another world, exploding into pieces on the floor. Latasca Field, Latrell's father, was completely losing control. It wasn't the first time, but this was the time when a 6-year-old's body recorded it deep enough that it could never be erased. No explanation, no reason a child could understand. Just the rage of a man who was drowning and pulling everything around him down with him, as if breaking enough things would stop the thing choking him inside. That night his father was arrested. The police came, the door closed, and Latrell stood in the middle of the destroyed room, watching his mother, Pamela Sprewell, the woman who never stopped, quietly kneel down to pick up every piece from the floor, not crying, not saying anything, just picking them up and putting them in a trash bag like this was part of the work she had long gotten used to. That 6-year-old kid didn't cry, didn't ask, just stood and watched. And in the silence of that night, not with words but with the way a body records into its bones the things the mind doesn't yet have language for, Latrell Sprewell learned the first lesson of his life. The men in your life will disappear. No reason needed. No explanation needed. They just disappear and leave the broken pieces for the woman who stays to kneel and pick up. Latasca Field was not a bad person in the way people use the word when they want the story to be simpler than reality. He was a man who had failed in the way so many black men in neighborhoods like North 41st Street, Milwaukee in the 1970s had failed. Not because he lacked love, not because of some naturally aggressive nature, but because he lacked a path, lacked opportunity, lacked anyone who stood up and told him there was another way out besides the ways that neighborhood provided. Drugs came like a shortcut, the way shortcuts always come, right when you're most exhausted and need the fastest answer. Prison came as the inevitable consequence. And the family, Pamela, Latrell, Taryn, Ponciana, were the ones left behind to pay the price for a decision they were never asked about. Sprewell later, throughout his career, almost never mentioned his father in front of cameras, not out of hatred. Hatred is something you reserve for people you still expect something from. But because there were wounds too deep, too complicated, too intertwined between love and loss, and not understanding why, to the point that no language was enough to express it in a studio-lit interview where they only gave you 3 minutes before moving. On to the next question about the season. The family moved to Flint, Michigan. Following the father, or following the hope that a new address could bring a new start. The hope that drowning families cling to like a life raft, even when they know the raft might not be strong enough. Flint was not better than Milwaukee. It was just different. And the problem wasn't the address, it was inside, following you into every new house, every new school, every morning you woke up trying to believe today would be different. In Flint, Latrell tried out for the high school basketball team for the first time. It wasn't because he had loved basketball for a long time, not because anyone had spotted and nurtured his talent, but because the basketball court was the only place in Flint where a black teenager with no money, no status, nothing at all could walk in without asking permission. The result of that tryout, he was cut. Not good enough. The answer was short, cold, and came with no explanation or encouragement, because they don't explain to kids they have no expectations for. For a teenager who had grown up not knowing what stability was, not knowing if his father would be home that night, not knowing if the electric bill would be paid next week, that rejection wasn't just about basketball. It was another confirmation of what life had whispered in his ear since the night he was 6 years old, standing there watching his mother kneel to pick up the pieces. You're not good enough. You don't belong here. You're not what people are waiting for. Then Latasca Field was arrested for the last time. This time it wasn't a gun. It wasn't causing trouble. This time it was possession of drugs with intent to distribute, a sentence heavy enough to end the question of where the family would go next. The family returned to Milwaukee. Latrell returned to the city where he was born, back with his mother, and started school at Washington High School on the north side of the city. And in that apartment from then on, there was no father, no man who sat down and told him, "This is how you handle it when you're so angry, you want to break everything around you. This is how you say the hard things to the people you love. This is how you stay when things get difficult instead of disappearing." No one taught those things. Instead, the lessons came from the streets, from the older guys in the neighborhood, from a culture where strength was defined by the way you didn't let anyone see you hurt. That pain was something you swallowed, not something you spoke, that if you needed help, then you were weak, and if you were weak, then you didn't survive in places like this. That was the baggage Latrell Sprewell carried onto the basketball court when Coach Gordon found him in the hallway at Washington High School. And it was also the baggage he carried into every locker room, every practice, every relationship throughout his life, with coaches who didn't understand his boundaries, with the woman he loved but didn't know how to love right, with the children he wanted to protect with everything, but no one had taught him how to protect. That baggage would give him the strength to get back up after every time he was knocked down. But that baggage would also be the thing that, in the most important moments of his life, pulled him down in ways that no $97 million could save. James Gordon wasn't looking for a star that day. He just saw a teenager wandering in the hallway at Washington High School like someone who didn't know where he was going, almost 2 meters tall, skinny as a rail, with the posture of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible in a world that didn't have a place ready for him. Gordon stopped and asked, "Do you want to try playing ball?" It wasn't a destined moment like people tell in inspirational sports stories. Not the moment where the music starts swelling and the light suddenly shines down in the right spot. It was just an adult who saw a drifting kid and offered the only thing he could offer, a question. Latrell nodded. Not because of burning passion, not because he had an NBA dream since he was little, but because he had nowhere else to go, and when you have nowhere else to go, any door that opens is worth walking through. In his senior year of high school, he averaged 28 points per game. Not because he had proper training, not because someone stood beside him, correcting every move from the time he was 10, but because in all the years before that, in Milwaukee and Flint, on cracked basketball courts no one owned and no one maintained, he had been there alone, in the dark after school, shooting the ball into the hoop over and over without knowing what he was running from. Maybe he was running from the apartment without a father. Maybe he was running from the silence of a family that had learned to live with things that couldn't be put into words. Maybe he wasn't running from anything. Maybe the basketball court was simply the only place where he didn't feel like he was taking up someone else's space. Whatever the reason, the result was 28 points per game, a number not from luck, but from someone who had paid for it with thousands of hours, with no one watching. No big university sent him letters. No scout flew to Milwaukee to watch him play. Sprewell graduated from Washington High School with a record good enough for someone to notice, but not good enough for someone to actually come find him. The only door that opened was Three Rivers Community College in Poplar Bluff, Missouri, a school so small that if you didn't have a reason to know it existed, you never would. He went there alone, no father dropping him off like the other kids. No mother, because Pamela Sprewell didn't have money to fly to Missouri, and didn't have time because she still had to work. No old friends network, no acquaintances there, nothing except one duffel bag, and the familiar way of someone who had learned not to need anyone from very early on. He did what he had always done his whole life. He turned loneliness into fuel. The first season made people notice. The second season, NJCA All-American, 26.6 points and 9.1 rebounds per game, school record with 1,488 points in 2 seasons. Numbers from someone who didn't play to be praised, but played like every game was the last chance anyone would give him. Then Alabama, then Allsec, then a year playing in one of the most competitive conferences in American college basketball and proving he wasn't a fluke, wasn't a star from some small league no one knew about. But in all those steps up, from Milwaukee to Poplar Bluff to Tuscaloosa, not once did anyone sit down next to him and ask honestly, "Are you okay? Do you need anything? Is there something heavy on your heart?" He learned how to shoot more accurately, learned how to read defensive schemes, learned how to play under pressure. But no one taught him how to accept help when he needed it, because no one thought to teach that, and because even if someone had, Latrell Sprewell had grown up in a house where needing help was something you weren't allowed to be, and the lessons from childhood took deeper root than any practice. The 1992 NBA Draft. The Golden State Warriors called his name at pick 24. Not in the first round, where the whole green room holds its breath, and families hug and cry, and the commissioner shakes your hand in front of the whole country. Pick 24 is where your agent pats you on the shoulder, someone shakes your hand, and then the next name is called, and your moment is already over before you can fully feel it. Sprewell stepped into the NBA without the organization's waiting excitement, without the pressure of big expectations, without the feeling that the world was looking at him and wanted him to succeed. He stepped in the way he had stepped into everything his whole life, like someone with no place ready, coming to a place where he had to create a spot for himself by proving he deserved to exist there. And that, the never-ending loop of having to prove, having to fight, having to claim what others were given, was what followed Latrell Sprewell from North 41st Street, Milwaukee, all the way to Oakland Coliseum Arena. He was always the one no one was really waiting for. And the shadow of that, the feeling that at any moment what he had could be taken away, that he had to fight for every inch of space he stood in, would be what made him great on the hardwood and what also made him fragile in ways the arena lights could never hide forever. The 1992-93 season, Oakland Coliseum Arena. For the first time in his life, Latrell Sprewell stepped onto the court under the lights of an NBA arena, and 60-9 out of 77 games that season, he was a starter. Not a bench player, not a fill-in, a starter. Averaging 15.4 points per game as a rookie, enough for all-rookie second team, enough for people to start noticing. Then the second season came, and the numbers jumped in a way even those who believed in him most didn't fully predict. 21.0 points, 4.9 rebounds, 4.7 assists, 2.2 steals per game. Sports experts started calling him the next Michael Jordan, a title they only put on the shoulders of those who really made them stop and look again. On the surface, that was the highest praise American basketball could give. But none of the people saying that stopped to ask, the next Jordan, under what conditions, with what system, with who beside him? Jordan had Phil Jackson, who understood each player's psychology in the locker room far deeper than most coaches understood basketball. Jordan had Scottie Pippen, who shared the load to the point that if one night Jordan had nothing left, Pippen was still there. Sprewell had an organization that was fumbling around, not knowing what direction it wanted to build the team. A locker room whose internal structure changed constantly with every trade season, and the familiar feeling from North 41st Street, Milwaukee, that if he didn't pull everything up himself, no one else would. The Oakland Coliseum lights shone bright with him every game night. The crowd stood up. His name was announced. And when the final buzzer sounded, when the lights went out and the arena slowly emptied, Latrell Sprewell went back to the locker room, then back to the hotel, then back to the apartment. And there, in the silence after the lights, there was no one. Not in the sense that he was physically alone, but in a deeper, harder-to-heal sense. There was no one really there for the part of him the court couldn't reach. In 1993, he fought with teammate Byron Houston in a practice. Houston was more than 20 kilograms heavier than him, described in the locker room as having the strength of Mike Tyson. The incident was handled, put in the file, and life continued. In 1995, conflict with Jerome Kersey in practice, this time more serious, enough for management to meet and discuss. Sprewell's file added another line, discipline issue, and that was all the system did. Put it in the file and continue. Not once in any of those times did anyone sit down next to him and ask honestly, what's going on with you? Is something weighing on you? Do you need to talk to someone? There was no psychological counseling. In 1993, that concept in American professional sports barely existed, especially for black players. The system had learned to see more as assets to manage than people to understand. No one talked real with him. Only punishment when he crossed the line and silence when he hadn't. The loop that a man who grew up in Latosca and Pamela Sprewell's house knew too well. You're not allowed to break, and if you do break, the consequences are yours to carry alone. Sprewell continued. He always continued. That was the only thing he knew how to do when he didn't know what else to do. In the 1993-94 season, he led the entire NBA in games played and minutes on the floor. First All-Star, All-NBA first team, All-Defensive second team. In the 1996-97 season, he averaged 24.2 points, career high, a number sports papers printed in bold and highlight shows, replayed over and over. But the Warriors that season won 30, lost 52. A team that was sinking with a player at the peak of his powers. And the gap between those two realities was where the most dangerous things lived. When you pour all your energy, all of it, holding nothing back, into proving you deserve to exist in a world with no place ready for you, there's nothing left to handle the things inside. Nothing left to look back and ask, why am I this angry? Why are my boundaries so thin? Why does every time someone touches the feeling that I don't control the situation I react like it's life or death? Those questions don't have easy answers, and Latrell Sprewell, the man who was never taught how to sit with hard questions, kept throwing them onto the basketball court. and hoping that 24.2 points per game was enough to hold it all together. The wounds from North 41st Street didn't disappear because you were scoring under the lights. They just waited, more patient than any defensive system, quieter than any crowd, and more certain than anything 24.2 points could buy. The 1997-98 season began. PJ. Carlesimo was hired as head coach, the man with a management style the whole locker room hated, who would stand on the Oakland practice floor and not know that there were boundaries that once crossed, you couldn't take back what happened next. People like to say the peak always comes before the fall. But for Latrell Sprewell, the peak and the fall had never been two separate points. They were the same moment, just seen from two different angles, and the distance between them was sometimes only 10 seconds. December 1st, 1997 was coming. And America was about to learn that when a man has carried enough for long enough without anyone asking if he was okay, the breaking point doesn't come with a warning. Warriors 1 win, 13 losses. Not 113 in the way people use when they want to say a team is going through a tough stretch, that things will get better, that this is just a dark patch before the light returns. But in the real, raw sense, with no words to soften it, every morning Latrell Sprewell woke up knowing that tonight he would step on the court, would give everything he had. Everything, holding nothing back. And tonight they would lose again. Not because he wasn't good enough, but because the system around him wasn't good enough, and there was no way one person, no matter how talented, could single-handedly drag a broken machine to the finish line. Every practice was a reminder that last season's 24.2 points meant nothing in a team falling apart from the inside. And standing on that practice floor, yelling in the players' ears with a management style the whole locker room, not one or two people, but all of them, couldn't stand, was PJ. Carlesimo, the new head coach of the Golden State Warriors for the 1997-98 season. Carlesimo wasn't the first and wouldn't be the last to use pressure as his main management tool. Yelling, constant criticism, pushing each player's boundaries to the limit and then pushing more. For many players, that was just part of the job, something you learned to tune out in your head and keep going. But Latrell Sprewell wasn't many players. He was the man who carried North 41st Street into every room he walked into, carrying the memory of a 6-year-old standing there watching his father lose control, carrying decades of learning that when someone invades your final boundary, no one comes to help, you handle it yourself. Carlesimo didn't know that. No one told him that. No one told Carlesimo that for some people, the way you approach them matters more than what you say. That there were old wounds that if you accidentally touched the right spot, the reaction wouldn't come from reason, but from somewhere much deeper, where reason had no control. December 1st, 1997. Practice at Oakland. Carlesimo stood watching the ball movement drill and wasn't happy. He called Sprewell's name, demanding the ball be passed more accurately, faster, better. It wasn't an unusual demand. Coaches asking players to adjust technique happens in every practice of every team in the world. But Latrell Sprewell heard that on that morning, in that season, after everything that had built up from long before, and inside him, in the man whose whole life had taught him, that no one was really there for him, that every presence was temporary. That control was the only illusion he could hold in a world that took everything else. Something broke. Not slowly, not with warning. It broke like something that had been cracked for a long time and just needed one small extra force. 10 seconds. Sprewell grabbed Carlesimo by the neck. Assistant coaches and teammates rushed in to pull him off. Sprewell left the practice floor, and 20 minutes later, after he had showered, changed clothes, had enough time to sit with what had just happened and decided it wasn't finished, he came back and continued. That second time was the part no explanation was enough for, no context could justify, no childhood story could cover up. The first 10 seconds could be the breaking point of a man who had carried too much for too long. But the decision to come back, the sober choice after 20 minutes, was what Latrell Sprewell would have to live with forever, and no one could take that responsibility off him. The news spread within hours. The Warriors terminated his contract, the remaining $23.7 million gone with a piece of paper. The NBA opened an investigation and issued the suspension. 68 games without pay, the longest in league history at that point. Latrell Sprewell's name appeared on every sports page, on every evening news program, on every morning radio show Americans listened to in their cars on the way to work. Every family sitting in front of the TV that night had an opinion. Every sports expert had an analysis. Every caller into radio shows had a verdict, and the verdict, almost without exception, was clear and final and needed no more information. Sprewell was the bad guy. Sprewell was proof of what was wrong with NBA basketball. Sprewell was something kids shouldn't look up to. And no one, not one of the millions judging him from their TV screens and newspaper pages and car seats, stopped long enough to ask the harder question. What had happened to that person long before Oakland Coliseum and million-dollar contracts and the name P.J. Carlesimo? What had built up in a man who grew up without a father, who witnessed violence as normal, who was never taught how to name the things happening inside him, who was never asked if he was okay by any system that passed through his life, school, college, NBA? No one asked. Because the story was easier to tell, easier to understand, easier to judge when the bad guy was completely bad and there was nothing more complicated that needed thinking about. 68 games. Latrell Sprewell sat at home for 68 NBA games that passed without him. No paycheck, no team. No hardwood under his feet, no ball in his hands, no lights. The only thing in his whole life where, when they turned on, all the noise inside temporarily stopped, all the wounds temporarily went quiet, and he was just a man doing what he was born to do. How long those nights during those 68 games were, how he sat with it all alone, how heavy the silence of a room without basketball was for a man whose basketball was the only thing from childhood that never left. He didn't say. No interview dug there. No question he answered real enough for people to see those nights. And that silence, the way he never described what those 68 games looked like from the inside, weighed heavier than any confession could. Because people only stay silent about things too heavy for words, things that if you start speaking them, you're not sure you can stop. The 10 seconds on December 1st, 1997, would follow Latrell Sprewell to the end of his life. Not like a wound that heals and leaves a scar. A scar, at least, is something you can see and know has passed, but like a label stuck on him from that day that no solvent could remove. No matter how many points he scored after that, no matter how far he led any team after that, no matter how many times he proved the man he wasn't those 10 seconds. The name Latrell Sprewell and the Carlesimo incident would always be called together, would always be the first sentence in any introduction, would always be what people remembered before remembering anything else. 13 seasons, 4 All-Star appearances, 8th seed to the NBA Finals, $97 million earned with his bare hands. All of that would become a small footnote underneath the 10 seconds he couldn't take back. And that perhaps was the truly heaviest sentence that day left behind. January of 1999. The NBA lockout had just ended. Jeff Van Gundy, Dave Checketts, and Ernie Grunfeld of the New York Knicks flew to Milwaukee to meet the man the entire United States had spent a year and a half judging. This was one of the most important meetings in Latrell Sprewell's career. Perhaps the meeting that would decide whether he would still play professional basketball in America or not. Van Gundy came with expectations. Not big ones, just the normal expectations people bring to an important meeting. That the person sitting in front of him would try, would want to impress, would wear something to show he understood the weight of this moment. Sprewell wore red basketball shorts and a tank top. Not out of arrogance. Arrogant people know they're breaking expectations and do it on purpose. This was a man who didn't know any other way, had never learned any other way, who grew up in a world where you didn't have time to learn how to perform appropriateness because you were busy surviving. Van Gundy later said he was immediately struck by that, not by the stifle but by what it said about the man sitting in front of him. This is a person who doesn't know how to pretend, who has never learned how to pretend, and that could be the most dangerous double-edged sword an NBA organization could sign to a contract. The Knicks signed him, and all of New York City, the city of people who never run out of opinions about anything, held its breath and wondered if this was the biggest mistake in franchise history. The answer came in the 1999 playoffs, and it came in a way none of the people asking that question could have imagined. The Knicks finished the shortened season as the 8th seed in the East, the lowest possible to make the playoffs, a team that by every logical basketball analysis had no chance to get past the first round, let alone anything further. First round, Miami Heat, the #1 seed, Knicks win. Not a lucky win, not a win because the opponent played bad, a win because there was a man on that hardwood who didn't accept the concept of no chance. Second round, Atlanta Hawks, Knicks win. Third round, Conference Finals, Indiana Pacers with Reggie Miller, and a team that on paper was more complete than the Knicks in every way. Knicks win. And for the first time in NBA history, an 8th-seeded team stood at the door of the finals. Something the league had never seen before and wouldn't see again for a long time. In all those games, when the Knicks needed someone who dared to hold the ball in the final seconds, when everything hung by a thread, when Madison Square Garden held its breath and 19,000 fans stood without knowing when they had stood up, the ball went to Sprewell, not because there was no other choice, but because in the locker room, no meeting needed, no discussion needed, everyone knew. The biggest moments belonged to the man who didn't fear big moments. The 1999 NBA Finals. San Antonio Spurs with Tim Duncan and David Robinson. Game 5. The last game of the series. The game where if the Knicks lost the season was over. Sprewell played 43 minutes and scored 35 points. Not enough to win. The Knicks lost. The season ended. But 35 points in the final game of a season no one believed they could reach. That number needed no further explanation about the man who created it. After that season, Sprewell stood in front of the cameras and said, "I'm the American dream." Part of America heard that and nodded. A kid with nothing from Milwaukee, cut from the high school team in Flint, picked 24th in a draft, suspended for 68 games and condemned by an entire nation, standing on the biggest stage of America's most beautiful sport, and saying he was proof that the dream was real. And that was true. No one could say that wasn't true. But the American dream doesn't have a small clause printed underneath. It doesn't tell you that the lights don't heal what the darkness left behind. It doesn't tell you that unnamed wounds don't disappear just because you're standing somewhere bright enough that others can't see them. It doesn't tell you that everything you haven't dealt with is waiting, more patient than any defense, quieter than any crowd, and will surely find its moment. The next 3 years with the Knicks, Sprewell played well. Not the absolute peak of his career, but well. Enough for New York to believe signing him was right, enough for the Garden to keep standing up when the ball touched his hands. But under the surface of those good seasons, the things the lights didn't shine on were still operating. The tensions in the locker room didn't disappear. They just got quieter because the Knicks were winning enough that no one wanted to dig deep. The pressure didn't disappear, it just changed shape. From the pressure to prove he wasn't what people thought he was, to the pressure to maintain the image he had rebuilt. And the feeling he had carried from 441st Street that everything you have is temporary, that it can be taken away at any time, that you're only borrowing something that doesn't really belong to you, didn't disappear just because New York loved him. It was there, every night after the lights went out and the arena emptied and he went home alone. And Minnesota was ahead. October of 1994. Sprewell was at the first peak of his career, just named to his first All-Star team, just led the entire NBA in minutes played, just becoming a name people start talking about in a different, heavier way, as if this was someone who could really go very far. Outside the lights of Oakland Coliseum, he had a family, Candace Cabill, the woman he met at Alabama in 1989, and their 4-year-old daughter playing in the backyard of their Oakland house on a normal October afternoon, like any other. The family's 2 pit bulls, the dog Sprewell raised, loved, trusted enough to keep near his children, attacked the little girl. Her right ear was completely torn off. Her face was injured so badly that doctors had to spend many hours on reconstructive surgery, and many of those hours were only the first step of a long journey no one chose and no one could prepare for. Sprewell stood in the hospital that day, the man whose whole season didn't know how to shake when holding the ball in the most important final seconds. And there was nothing in all he had learned on the basketball court that could help him handle what was happening before his eyes. He had both dogs put to sleep afterward, not because he didn't love them, but because there are things that after they happen, you can't pretend everything is still the same. He rarely spoke about that day. Throughout his career, through hundreds of interviews about basketball and scandals and money and all the things people wanted to ask him, he almost never mentioned his daughter. Only once, in an interview with the New York Post after joining the Knicks, when the reporter asked about the accident, he said, "Her right ear was completely torn off, and so much was happening at the same time. At that time, I just didn't want the media coming to the hospital and pointing cameras in our faces. She has scars for life. I just wanted the media to leave her alone." Then he stopped, said nothing more, changed the subject, and the reporter, like every reporter before and after, let him, because there are doors that when the man sitting in front of you closes them that way, you know no next question is allowed. But in that sentence, in the way he said, "I just wanted them to leave her alone," in the way her wasn't a name, wasn't a description, but something so painful he couldn't say anything else, was everything a father needed to say and never needed to explain further. He met Candace Cabill at the University of Alabama in 1909, when he was still an unknown college player outside the SEC. They never married, never, but lived together like husband and wife for nearly 20 years, had 4 children, built a life that from the outside looked complete in the way money could create. When his career took him to New York, Sprewell bought a house in Purchase, New York, a $3 million house, enough rooms for the whole family, big enough to be something the kid from North 41st Street, Milwaukee, never dared imagine. He hired help, bought Candace a new car, registered her with the NBA as wife, so she and the kids could have health insurance, their joint bank account rarely below $100,000 in the peak years. That was what he knew how to do. Make money, use money to create stability, replace with money the things he had no language to give in other ways. When the summer of 2003 took him to the Minnesota Timberwolves, Candace sat down and decided that she and the 4 kids would stay in Purchase, New York, so they wouldn't have to change schools, wouldn't lose friends, wouldn't have to start over in a strange city. That was the decision of a father thinking about his children. It was also the decision of a man who didn't realize that geographic distance, when placed on the foundation of a relationship that had never learned how to truly communicate, wasn't something you could make up for with weekend visits or hurried phone calls between games. Sprewell learned how to play in every condition: home court, away court, the playoffs, in games where the whole team was losing, and only he still believed they could win. But no one taught him how to love someone across distance, how to keep a relationship warm when you're at 2 ends of the country and the phone calls get shorter each week. Because no one had ever taught him that. No father in the house to watch as an example. No one who sat down and explained that love wasn't just providing money and a safe space, but also being present in ways that can't be measured by a bank account. People talk about Latrell Sprewell as a talented player who self-destructed, as a scandal, as a lesson that sports students learn in financial management classes. No one talks about him as the father standing in the hallway of an Oakland hospital in October of 1994, looking at the door to the operating room and having nothing in all his strength and speed and willpower that could do anything other than wait. No one talks about that fear, the real and persistent fear of a man who grew up without a father, who had promised himself he wouldn't become that, looking at his own children and realizing that trying not to become that wasn't enough if you didn't know what you needed to become instead. You can't give what you were never given. You can't teach what you were never taught. And Latrell Sprewell, in everything he did and didn't do, was a man who carried his father's wounds into his own life, not because he wanted to, but because that was all he had. When the Timberwolves offered $21 million in the summer of 2004, and Sprewell turned it down and then said he needed to feed his family, America laughed. Radio stations ran that quote like a joke. Sports experts used it as an example of how out of touch rich NBA players are. But if you knew about that October afternoon in 1994 in the backyard of the house in Oakland, about the hospital visits afterward, about the scar on his daughter's face that he couldn't protect, if you knew about Candace and the 4 kids in Purchase, New York, about the growing distance he had no tools to close, then that quote was no longer a joke. It was the cry of a man trying to use money to hold on to the things money wasn't enough to hold, and knowing it, and not knowing any other way. The 2003 to 2004 season, Minneapolis, Minnesota. Latrell Sprewell arrived at the Timberwolves in a trade in the summer of 2003, stepping into a locker room with Kevin Garnett, the man they called KG, the man whose presence on the court changed the atmosphere in the arena in a way not every player could create. Together with Sam Cassell, the 3 of them formed what analysts called the most fearsome offensive trio in the NBA that season. Not because they were the youngest or the most expensive names, but because they were men who had been through enough to know that opportunities don't come twice, and you give everything when they do. The Timberwolves finished the season with a 58-win, 24-loss record, the best in franchise history at that point, the #1 seed in the West, and they reached the conference finals for the first and only time in franchise history before losing to the Los Angeles Lakers of Kobe and Shaq. That season, Sprewell averaged 16.8 points per game. In the conference finals, the number jumped to 20.8 because Latrell Sprewell always played better when the stakes were higher, when the pressure was heavy enough to make others shrink, and he did not. He was 33 years old, no longer young by the standards of a league that was getting faster and jumping higher. But still capable, he knew it, the coach knew it, and the Timberwolves knew it. That was why they came to him in the summer of 2004 with a contract extension offer. 3 years, $21 million. Sprewell looked at that number. The previous season he had made $14.6 million, meaning the new offer, on average, was $7 million per year, almost half of what he had just played at. Lower, while he had just helped the team achieve their best record in history. Lower, while he had just averaged 20.8 points in the conference finals. He turned it down, and then he said, in front of the cameras, with the blunt honesty of a man who had never learned to filter, because no one had ever taught him that there are things you think but don't say. Why would I want to help them win a title? They don't deserve that. I have a lot at stake and I got my family to feed. That quote aired nationwide within hours. And America, the America that had built a billion-dollar industry on the backs of men like Latrell Sprewell, that had bought tickets to watch him play, that had bought jerseys with his name, that had sat in front of TV screens every night to watch him give everything, spoke up. He's making $14 million a year, and it's still not enough to feed his family. On the radio, on TV, in the morning sports shows Americans listen to in their cars on the way to work. In the sports columns, they read with their coffee. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone knew exactly where Latrell Sprewell was wrong, where he was lacking, where he didn't understand life. The story was too neat, too easy to tell, too perfect as an example of everything people wanted to believe about rich, out-of-touch NBA players. No one stopped long enough in the silence to ask the other questions. No one asked what was really happening in that man's life in the summer of 2004. The bills piling up, the financial commitments promised to a large family, the feeling of a 33-year-old man who knew the remaining seasons were getting fewer, and each contract might be the last. No one asked that for a man who grew up in the North 41st Street apartment where they didn't know if there would be enough money for the electric bill this week. Whether $7 million a year felt like enough or like an insult, depending on what you carried from before. On the way childhood scarcity leaves, prints that never fully disappear, no matter how the bank account changes. No one asked those questions. And Sprewell's answer, the raw, unfiltered answer, not polished for public relations, only confirmed what people already wanted to believe. No team signed him for the 2004 to 2005 season. His agent's phone had a few calls. Dallas Mavericks, San Antonio Spurs. But nothing enough for him to accept at the level he thought he deserved. And then the season started without his name on any roster. He trained alone. He waited. He believed someone would call. That 13 seasons, 4 All-Star appearances, 35 points in Game 5 of the NBA Finals was something that couldn't be forgotten by all 30 teams in the league at once. But no call came. A year passed in silence. Then the 2005 to 2006 season began, again without his name. And in the silence of that second season, without announcement, without ceremony, without anyone saying it out loud, Latrell Sprewell's career ended. Not with a final game where fans stood and applauded, and his name was announced one last time over the speakers of an NBA arena. Not with a press conference where he sat in front of the microphone and said goodbye to the sport that had given him everything and taken everything. Not with anything except a gradual absence. One day without training, 1 week without a call, 1 month without an offer, 1 season without his name on the score sheet. Until no one asked anymore, and the question stopped being asked because the answer had become too obvious to need words. 13 seasons, $97 million, 4 All-Star appearances, the man who dragged an 8th seed to the NBA Finals. The man who, when the ball came to his hands in the most important final seconds, the whole arena knew what was coming. All of that, and his career ended with no one clapping, no one saying thank you, no moment to look back and tell himself that no matter what, this was a journey that deserved to end in a way that honored it. Only silence. And in that silence, Latrell Sprewell, 35 years old, without a team, without the lights, began to step into the rest of his life with all the things waiting for him outside basketball. The things basketball had temporarily held back for 13 seasons and now had no reason to hold back any longer. Milwaukee's best. He named that yacht like a declaration, not a declaration for others, but for himself, for the kid from North 41st Street, who grew up not knowing if there would be dinner tomorrow, for the old version of himself, standing there, watching his mother kneel to pick up the broken pieces on the floor that April night in 1977. I was born in Milwaukee. I got out. I am the best thing that city ever produced. The 70-foot boat, worth $1.5 million, sat on the water with that name painted on its hull like a signature. Who could blame him for wanting that? A kid who grew up in an apartment where the lights depended on someone remembering to pay the electric bill. When he finally had enough money to buy anything, the urge to prove he had reached a place he never thought he would reach wasn't arrogance. It was survival screaming in the only way it knew. He also owned more than 20 cars, a customized Lamborghini Diablo, Rolls-Royce Phantom, Maybach with a champagne chiller in the armrest. Things a kid from Milwaukee wouldn't have dared imagine even in his dreams. And he bought them because he could, because life had told him for too long that he couldn't have anything, and now life was saying the opposite, and he listened. August of 2007. The bank employees came. Not during the day when the light was still enough to soften the humiliation. Not with the kindness of people who knew that behind the debt was a human being. The boat named Milwaukee's Best was towed away from the dock. The unpaid debt, $1.3 million. In February 2008, the yacht was sold at auction. The buyer paid $856,000, a number almost $650,000 less than what the bank needed to recover, and the bank announced it would continue to pursue the remaining amount. The name Milwaukee's Best disappeared from the water. The declaration disappeared with it, and nothing replaced the emptiness except the shrinking numbers in the account each month. In 1994, the year his daughter had the accident, the year he was first named an All-Star, the year when everything seemed to be heading in the right direction for the first time in his life, Sprewell bought a house in River Hills, Milwaukee. Not the most luxurious house he owned, but the house that meant something different from all the others. This was Milwaukee. This was the city that had given birth to him. And this house was a promise to himself. I will not let my family live the way I lived. I will not let my children grow up in a place where stability is a luxury. That house stood as proof of that promise, until it could no longer stand. The first month, the mortgage payment of $2,593 wasn't made. Not because he didn't have money before, but because the money no longer came the way it once had, and the spending didn't slow down at the same pace that the income had stopped. The second month, the third month, the foreclosure process began, slow and irreversible like the tide coming in, and in Westchester County, New York, where Candace and the 4 kids were living in the $3 million house he had bought as another promise, a promise that his family would have a stable place even if he wasn't there. The foreclosure process also began in July 2009. 2 houses, 2 promises. Both disappeared in the same way, slowly through paperwork, without drama, only numbers and deadlines and letters from the bank that he no longer had enough to answer. In 2011, the state of Wisconsin released a list of people who owed more than $25,000 in income taxes. Latrell Sprewell's name was on it. The amount, $3.5 million in unpaid taxes, $97 million. That was the number ESPN estimated he had earned over 13 NBA seasons. The number people quoted every time they wanted to explain why his story was the perfect cautionary tale about what not to do with money. And by 2011, almost all of that money was gone. Not gone in a dramatic way, not in one night, but gone in the way things truly disappear, little by little, month by month, through unpaid debts and unkept promises, until one day you look back and there is nothing left to look at. January of 2007. Candace Cabell filed a $200 million lawsuit against Latrell Sprewell. $200 million. A number so large that when people first read it, the first reaction was disbelief. But the number wasn't the most important thing in that lawsuit. The most important thing was what led to it. Nearly 20 years, from Alabama in 1989 to January 2007, of a woman who had believed in a promise and built her life on the foundation of that promise. Candace gave up a $25,000 a year hospital job to give birth to and care for their first child in 1995, because he told her he would take care of it, because when you love someone and that person tells you everything will be okay, you believe, especially when the joint bank account rarely went below $100,000, and the future seen through the windows of the $3 million house in Purchase, New York seemed believable. He registered her with the NBA as wife so she could have health insurance. She stayed in New York with the 4 kids when he moved to Minnesota in 2003. Because he asked her to, because he thought it was best for the children, because she trusted him enough not to ask more. Then, in December 2006, according to the lawsuit, Sprewell walked into the house and announced that he wanted to end the relationship. She accused him of cutting financial support for her and the 4 children, who at the time were 3, 7, 8, and 11 years old. She accused him of assaulting her when she tried to call the police. She accused him of dragging her down the stairs. The court ruled. Latrell Sprewell was allowed to contact his children only by phone, by email, by text. Not in person, not present for the mornings when they woke up and looked around the room for their father. Not present for the dinners. Not present for the afternoons after school when the kids came home and wanted to tell someone about their day. Not present for birthdays. Not present for the ordinary, unnamed, unrecorded moments. The moments you only understand when you lose them. He lost the yacht, lost the houses, lost the money. Those things hurt. But money can be earned again, even if slowly and with difficulty. Houses can be bought again, even if smaller and more modest. The years without seeing his children's faces, the years when the kids grew up day by day and he wasn't there, nothing in this world could give those back. No court ruling could return those mornings. No amount of money was enough to buy back those years. They disappeared along with everything else, but differently from everything else that they disappeared without even leaving the possibility of starting over. The headlines poured down, as everyone knew they would. Sprewell bankrupt, a lesson in financial insanity. From $97 million to nothing, the cautionary tale of an NBA star. Latrell Sprewell and what not to do with money. Those stories treated him like a number, an example, a case study for financial management students. None of the people writing those headlines stopped to ask what had really happened. Not with the money, but with the person. No one looked at a kid from Milwaukee who was never taught how to manage money because there was no money to manage throughout his childhood, who was never prepared for sudden wealth by any system, not school, not college, not the NBA, who never had a real financial advisor network that wasn't also trying to take their cut from that money. No one looked at a man who had shared money with a large family because that was the only thing he knew how to give, who had tried to create stability for the people he loved with the only thing life had taught him could create stability, money, and had failed in the way anyone without preparation, without a support system, without anyone truly on their side with their own agenda, could also fail. Instead, America looked at Latrell Sprewell and saw what it wanted to see, proof that the system works, that those who fail deserve to fail, that the story could be wrapped up in a headline and a clear lesson, and everyone could move on without having to sit with the discomfort of questions that had no neat answers. And America moved on, as it always does. There is a pattern in Latrell Sprewell's life that if you look long enough, you will see. 1993. Conflict with Byron Houston in practice with the Warriors. 1995. Conflict with Jerome Kersey. 1997. The Carlesimo incident. 2006. A 21-year-old woman accused him of assaulting her on the yacht. Police investigated. No charges. But his name was once again in the papers in the way he never wanted. 2006. Candace. 2007. The court. That pattern stretched over more than a decade, across multiple cities, multiple teams, multiple situations. And throughout that more than a decade, not one organization, not the Warriors, not the Knicks, not the Timberwolves, not the NBA, not any system that passed through his life, stopped to ask the question that should have been asked long before. What does this man need that he has never been given? What is happening inside him that no practice, no contract, no fine can reach? Instead, the system did what the system knew how to do: punish, put it in the file, continue. And when the punishment didn't change the behavior, the system punished harder, added more to the file, continued. No one asked why, because asking why is more complicated, takes more time. And big organizations don't have time for complicated questions when they have schedules to keep and contracts to sign and money to make. There are 4 children. Their names were never made public in any article, any interview, any document about Latrell Sprewell's life. Not because the press didn't try to find them, but because in all the things he couldn't protect, his reputation, his money, his houses, his right to tell his own story in his own way, he protected this. His children's names. No one knows. No one gets to know. That was the final boundary he held when all the other boundaries had broken. On his Instagram today, the account with 48,000 followers, where he posts photos standing next to current NBA players, photos at Knicks games, photos with people the lights are still shining on. There is not a single picture with his children, not one, not because he doesn't love them. People don't protect the names of things they don't love. People don't hold a boundary for 20 years over things they don't care about. But because there are wounds too deep, too private, too impossible to explain in a photo caption, and because there are distances, once formed the way theirs were formed, that cannot be closed just by posting a picture on social media. 4 children, all grown now. All grown up in the years when their father was only allowed to contact them by phone and email and text. How did they grow up with that? What do they think of their father? Do they understand? Or do they only know the part of the story the press told? No one knows, because no one asked them. And Sprewell doesn't speak. He never spoke. No interview after everything fell apart had him sit down and talk about what he felt. No memoir, no podcast where he looked back and explained. No social media post admitting there were things he wished he had done differently. People called that arrogance. People called that an inability to take responsibility. But it wasn't arrogance, and it wasn't an inability to take responsibility. It was a man who grew up in a house where pain was something you swallowed, not something you spoke out. Who grew up in a culture and a circumstance where if you fell, you stood up and kept going and didn't tell anyone you had fallen. Because saying it was weakness, and weakness was something you weren't allowed to be. He learned that lesson from the time he was 6 years old, standing there watching his mother kneel to pick up the broken pieces without crying, without complaining, just continuing. He learned it on every cracked basketball court in Milwaukee and Flint when no one was watching. He learned it during the 68-game suspension when he sat at home alone and didn't tell anyone how long those nights were. And he applied that lesson to everything. Even the things that lesson didn't fit. Even the moments where speaking might have changed everything. Even the relationships where silence wasn't strength, but a wall keeping others from getting close enough to help. And that, the way the survival lessons of childhood become the thing that destroys the things you love most as an adult, was the truest, deepest, and least seen wound in Latrell Sprewell's entire story. Not the Carlesimo incident, not the $21 million, not the bankruptcy, but the way a 6-year-old kid learned how to survive in the dark. And the 54-year-old man was still living by that lesson, because no one, throughout all those years, had taught him a different one. January of 2013, Milwaukee police received a noise complaint call. Address: the rental house where Latrell Sprewell was living. Reason: music too loud. Police arrived. Sprewell was arrested for disorderly conduct. Processed. His name went into the report. That was the last time Latrell Sprewell's name appeared significantly in American news. Not for a performance. Not for a statement. Not for anything related to basketball or money or the big controversies his name had once been attached to. For music too loud. In a rental house in Milwaukee. His name appeared that time, not on the sports page, not in the main news, a small item, the smallest corner of the page, the local Milwaukee news section, the kind of item people skim in 30 seconds and forget right after turning the page. Latrell Sprewell, the man 19,000 fans at Madison Square Garden once stood and roared for when his name was announced. The man an entire city once held its breath for when the ball touched his hands in the most important final seconds. The man the biggest sports papers in America once gave front-page coverage. The man ESPN once replayed highlights of as if it was unbelievable that a human body could do those things. Now, music too loud. Local Milwaukee news. 30 seconds, read then turn the page. People might think that was the lowest point. But the lowest point isn't the last time your name appears in the papers. The lowest point is what happens after that. When your name no longer appears at all. When the world no longer cares enough to write about you. Good or bad. When your absence doesn't create any void that needs to be filled. After January 2013, Latrell Sprewell's name almost completely disappeared from American news. Not because his life became peaceful. Peace is something you build, something you choose, something that comes after you have dealt with the things that need dealing with. There is no evidence that the years after 2013 were peaceful in that sense. But because the world had found its next cautionary tale, there were other NBA players with other financial decisions and other scandals and other headlines for people to read and judge and feel like they understood something important about the world. Sprewell had been used up, the cautionary tale had been told, the lesson had been learned, or at least people thought so. No reason to go back. And Sprewell, as he had always done, from the years wandering in the hallway at Washington High School before Coach Gordon saw him, from the years working in the dark on basketball courts no one owned in Milwaukee and Flint, once again became invisible. Not because he disappeared. He was still there, still waking up every morning in Milwaukee, still living in the city that had given birth to him, the city he had put on his yacht as a declaration, and now the yacht was gone. And the city's name remained only in memory, still carrying everything life had placed in him. The wounds from his father, the children he couldn't see, the years that had passed that couldn't be taken back, the name attached to 10 seconds he couldn't erase. Still there, but no one was looking anymore. And sometimes, no one looking is heavier than all the times people looked in the wrong ways. Today, Latrell Sprewell is 54 years old, living in a rental house in Milwaukee. The city he had once sworn to himself he would leave forever, the city he put on his yacht as a declaration of how far he had come, and also the only city left to return to when everywhere else had closed its doors. Not the $3 million house in Purchase, New York, not the mansion in Westchester County, not any of the things that $97 million had once been able to buy, but a rental house on a street in Milwaukee, not too far from North 41st Street where it all began, as if life had drawn a circle he wasn't asked about before it was drawn. The body from 13 NBA seasons left its marks in ways no insurance contract could fully cover, and no amount of money could buy back. Knees that endured thousands of landings over 13 years, a back that carried the weight of practices that started before sunrise and ended after the practice lights went out, the pains that players don't talk about while they're still playing, because talking about it means weakness, and weakness means being replaced, and no one asks after retirement because when you're no longer useful to the system is no longer curious about whether you're okay. On his Instagram, his bio reads, "Retired athlete GSW, Knicks and Timberwolves. Currently doing community relations with Knicks and MSG media personality. 48,000 followers. A number that if you didn't know who he was would look normal, but if you remembered those nights at the Garden when 19,000 people stood up for his name, then 48,000 followers on a platform where regular people can have more just by posting pictures of breakfast. That number carries its own weight, a kind of weight that needs no further explanation. He appears at Knicks games, sitting courtside, smiling with current players and celebrities and people the lights are still shining on, and that smile looks real, because he had learned how to make it look real from very early on. From the years he had to stand in front of cameras right after the most painful losses and answer questions with the face of a man who didn't allow himself to lose. No one knows what is behind that smile. No one asks, and he doesn't say. In 2017, in a short YouTube interview with the Knicks, the interviewer asked him what he remembered most from his career. A polite question, the kind people ask when they want to give someone a chance to look back on the good days, and Sprewell answered without thinking, without a second to choose his words. The playoffs. Not the money, not the contracts, not the lights or the fame or anything outsiders usually think of when thinking about what an NBA player remembers most. The playoff runs, the nights when all the chaos of his life, all the wounds and distances and loneliness and unanswered questions narrowed down to one thing: a ball, a hardwood floor, and a will that refused to submit no matter the circumstances. Those nights were the only thing in his entire life where, when they happened, everything else temporarily went quiet. Not disappeared, just quiet long enough for him to breathe, long enough for him to be himself, without having to fight anything except the game in front of him. And now even that is only a memory. The kind of memory you can't live in, only visit occasionally, before stepping back out and continuing with the present, with the rental house in Milwaukee, with the body that hurts in ways no one asks about, with 4 children whose names are not in any newspaper because he protected that to the end, even when he couldn't protect many other things, and with the silence of a man who had learned how to keep going from the time he was 6 years old and had never learned how to do anything else. History remembers the Carlesimo incident, remembers the quote about $21 million, remembers the headlines about bankruptcy and foreclosure, and the $200 million lawsuit. History is very good at remembering the things it wants to remember, the things that are neat and easy to tell, and fit the story it has already decided to tell. But history does not remember the kid from Milwaukee, who was cut from the high school basketball team in Flint for not being good enough, does not remember the young man who went alone to Three Rivers Community College in Poplar Bluff, Missouri, with no one behind him, and became an NJCAA All-American, averaging 26.6 points per game. Then broke the school record, then went to Alabama, then to the NBA at the 24th pick of a draft where no one had big expectations, and led an 8th-seeded team farther than any 8th seed in league history, does not remember the father standing in the hallway of an Oakland hospital in October 1994, looking at the door to the operating room, where his 4-year-old daughter lay with her right ear completely torn off and having nothing in all his strength and speed and willpower that could do anything other than stand there and wait. Does not remember the nights during the 68-game suspension, when he sat alone in the apartment, and the silence was so heavy, no language was enough to express it. Does not remember anything more complicated, more human, more real than the headlines it chose to remember. Because those things require you to sit longer with discomfort, require you to ask questions that have no neat answers, require you to look at the system and ask what the system did and did not do. The NBA in 2024 has a mental health support program for players, mandatory financial counseling for rookies, a retired players support network, people paid to ask if players are okay, not because the league suddenly became kinder, but because there have been enough stories like Sprewell's that ignoring them became more expensive than addressing them. In 1992, none of that existed. A 21-year-old kid from Milwaukee, carrying the memory of his father losing control that April night in 1977, carrying the years of not knowing what stability was, carrying the entire history of a kid who was never taught how to name the things happening inside him or how to accept help when he needed it, stepped into a system that gave him $15 million, put him under the lights of 20,000 fans, demanded he give everything every night, and not once during those 13 seasons stopped to ask if he was okay, what he needed, if there was something eating away at him from the inside that no one could see. And when he broke in the ways unsupported people always eventually break, the system punished him, put it in the file, and continued looking for someone else to take everything they could give. That wasn't just Latrell Sprewell's fault. That was the fault of a system that knew exactly what it wanted from men like him: speed, points, playoff nights that made fans stand up and advertising money keep flowing, and never really cared about what it needed to give back so those men could survive a little more whole after it was all over, and now the story comes back to you, not in the way these videos usually come back, with a neat lesson and a positive call to action, and the feeling that you just learned something important, and life goes on, but in a heavier, more uncomfortable way. The way a real story comes back when it has no beautiful ending to give you. When you look at Latrell Sprewell's life, all the things that were lost, and all the wounds that never healed, and all the moments where a different intervention, a question asked at the right time, one person stopping long enough to look at the human instead of just the player, could have changed everything in ways no one can know for sure, but all of us can feel. What do you see? What do you really see when you don't allow yourself to look the way the press taught you to look? When you stop long enough to look past the headlines and into the person behind them? A failure? Maybe. A victim of circumstances? Also maybe. But perhaps, a man far more complex than any headline could contain, more complex than a cautionary tale, more complex than a financial management lesson, more complex than 10 seconds in 1997, and a quote about $21 million, and the empty numbers in a bank account. A man who, if you look long enough and real enough, you will see not only his mistakes, but also all the things no one did for him, all the questions no one asked, all the gaps the system left and he had to fill himself with the only things he had: willpower, speed, stubborn refusal to submit, and eventually money, and eventually nothing. And this is what this story really asks you. Not about Latrell Sprewell, but about the people existing right now, in the NBA in 2024, in the NFL, in any system that gives young people from places like North 41st Street, Milwaukee power and money and lights, without asking if they are ready, without asking what wounds they carry that no one has helped them heal, without asking if they know how to love, how to accept help, how to exist when the lights go out. The kids becoming stars right now, without a foundation to handle it, and we are watching their plays and buying their jerseys and opening beers to sit in front of the TV and watch them give everything every night without asking the question we should be asking. What is this system taking from those people? And what is it giving back? And when everything ends and the lights go off and their names disappear from the papers, what do they have left, and who is responsible for that? The question isn't what Sprewell did wrong. He did wrong things. That cannot be denied, and this story is not trying to deny it. The question is what we, as fans sitting and watching and judging, as a system that takes everything people like him can give, did wrong to him and are doing wrong to the ones who come next. So leave a comment below. Not because this story has a beautiful ending to share, not because you feel better after watching and want to spread that feeling, but because stories without beautiful endings also deserve to be told and heard and sat with, even if they are uncomfortable, even if they don't let you stand up after watching with the feeling that the world is neat and fair and everything has meaning. Share this video not as a lesson, but as a reminder that behind every name in the papers, behind every headline about scandal and bankruptcy and cautionary tales, is a real person with real wounds that started very early and went very deep and were never looked at the right way. And subscribe to the channel if you want to keep looking at stories like this in the way they deserve to be looked at. Not through headlines, not through numbers, but through the person. And the next time you look at someone and only see their mistakes, only see the end of their story without seeing the beginning, stop for 1 second, just 1 second, and ask, what created that person before any mistakes? Who wasn't there when they should have been? And if someone had stopped long enough to ask the right question at the right time, then perhaps, just perhaps, the story would have ended differently.